Hola. Oh, today.
Hello, Katrina.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
No. That's it.
Recording in progress.
That's it. She said,
Geshe will be traveling in India in the next month, and so we will pause our teachings. Today will be the last teaching until the end of September, so please keep an eye on the website for when we resume the teachings. Okay, we'll begin with some preliminary prayers, and the link for that is in the chat box. To the teacher endowed, transcend and destroy, the one that's gone, the foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, nor the world's supreme guide of beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans, to you the Buddha endowed, transcend and destroy, the glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, make offerings and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you are born on this earth, you pay 7 strides and said, I'm supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With your body's form supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain. Fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme sign, space like a spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop, a dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the ways of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niyatayami. I take refuge until I am awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
자, 닉송겐.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, no one to tell. Oh yeah, I got shoot. Geshe chimbo shewa le song le ro. Tenjun dine nye bar shindu ka. Kibi tenrup toba chuba la. Ketin dila penba madrup na chindi yanda chuba kalan yorus. She song bata. Rajo tanda top debe mili di ra. Ane shu chuba la. Delishin. Omba. Nyawa yi tenru rabatin li ke yu na. Ni ha. Shu chuba tini kuka mengen tindi li ke yu na. Shu chuba la metalo ra. Dewa ke. Shu chuba la telo. Jorba si tenji samatam jen jor dema. Ra. Tenjun dini si. Nyebar shinduka. Tatunda. Shu chuba la tenji samatangen. Ra. Gajin rupa chu chi. Xie na me gunga ra tindi. Mayinde. Chu matarsa nangbe chu. Sanji chumde de chu matarsa longba ra tindi le ma jiba che. Tindi ko. Shu chuba la telwa re. Kombarwa. Xie na che yo ra. Tenji saman jo tere. Tenjun dini. Nyebar shinduka ase. Di shindu tari nga zu top dewe mili di. Pe shindu na nyeba kawa chire se. Sa chenpu chire songyo na. Kare se na. Nye kawa yende. Di gyutu we di shindu na kawa re songre. Gyutu we shindu kawa kandu re se na. Jida mi lu toba tsamre ya. Shala miki wa chu chawa pangpa la soba. Tsutim. Miki chu tsutim namba taba songyo ya ra. Tsutim songyo ya ra. Tene milu kebar shen toba la ya. Te tendo ane chi shanda sanje tenpa dan che malam kiwa lama da malam yuwa. Tende da di ko yuwa da. Tenda mili toba li ya sutim nambar taba song ya te miki chu pang kiwa chu tu ya shindu kawu da. Kombo re. Tende yuwa shi. Tende ka su re. Te tendo de chimba da sutim de ta song ne mili keba ina ya. Yang chimba mada na longju ulbu tinte chana kale yuwa da. Tanko chimba tongko re, chimba longju chimbu cho ya to dalya. Longju chimbu me longju kange yu na chio shita samlu tang to ya yo ma ra. Di longju chimbu yo kore. Longju di peshu tang sa di milu kebar shen chi to kore ma to. Tendu rabu tinte ten ya. Ani ku chimbu rabu so da, penshu chimbu ra cha na ku peshu yabu tang to ma to. Tenjun dini. Nyeba shindu ka se tere. Nika ta tanda chitim songwa ta, chimba ta, soba la soba ta, ne molam kya kore ra, chimba chitim soba samden, shirab la soba kanga chi kyujin sangu yo ra, tanda nga ra tsum mili dilya, kya nga matindil komba chebe, tedi sandi yo ra. Ti ndiko tende, ti kyudi shindu tu kawa yinbe na, tenchun teni nyeba shindu ka, stari lenji sam nyeba res.
So, to begin with, as the Master Shantideva says, this life of leisures and endowments is extremely difficult to find, and this is something by which we can accomplish the aims of beings. However, if we fail to do that now, then how could we possibly gain such a life again in the future? So right now we have this kind of life with all of the sort of freedoms or leisures to be able to practice the Dharma. If we were, say, born in a hell realm, or if we were born in a kind of country wherein the Dharma had not spread, we wouldn't have this sort of opportunity. All of the kinds of conducive conditions that are necessary for doing the Dharma. But to get all of this kind of life, one where we have encountered the teachings, one where we have all of these kinds of conditions, we should recognize this as something that is quite rare. We should see this as valuable, as precious. When we look at how difficult it is to find, we can think about it being difficult in terms of the causes that are necessary. Just to gain a human rebirth, not even a sort of particularly special human rebirth, we need to guard ethical conduct. We need to abandon the 10 non-virtues. And that in and of itself is quite rare, to have that kind of ethical conduct that will lead to a good rebirth. And in addition to that, we need to make the kind of efforts at other activities that will provide the sort of conducive conditions, making prayers that all of this come together. So if we want to have this kind of particularly special sort of human life, we have to engage in the proper sort of things like ethical conduct as a basis, but also generosity and patience and joyous effort and so forth. And if we have not done those actions, there's no way that we're going to gain this kind of a rebirth. So we want to ensure that we have a good life as a human, but additionally, we need to have things like enough possessions to be able to sustain ourselves. If we are in abject poverty, it becomes quite difficult to do any kind of Dharma practice. And so too, if we don't have a human rebirth, but experience the results of generosity ripening, we don't really know how to use those possessions, those objects in a beneficial way. So we need to ensure that we don't get a bad rebirth with the sort of good conditions ripening on that. So here it is the case that these causes are extremely rare, and we need to make the kind of effort at developing those causes, as well as making prayers that all of those come together such that we have this kind of fortunate rebirth again in the future.
Oh yeah. Oh, that coca soda. Narada tanda to de melody to Velia, honey. Kumambo to Kawasan that to cover the soda. Chimba Tsutim de Kuredo, Saba Comgore, Saba Magona, Chimba Tsutim to Yabuyon to Yomare. Saba Magona, and it gets a mambo jameta. Rangi music Tana Tom Medova. Roa, Yetumehoa, Tinder Tonte Ariada. Chinda Tsutim Saba. Chindu Samgura Tit and Dolek. Chindu Kavala Toshindo. Jumbo Gore. Some days it is told some time, same thoughts. She needs any song, Makina, Kena. She told Tenda summertime, taken to some jog or did I take something to that bungy in some. Nishirab is going on my syrup like thoughts, Chambache or the taste on that Tandanga. Dingy come now, come Tongue. Shirab the Chabachena, Chetunguchi Gora, or take care de Chimba children sober something like sober, going on my combo mambuch and Yongora. Oh, this on that Shindune. Nibakawarese. Di Chutim Suati, Miki Chubong Chutimse. Di Tolia, Shala Chabon Bechutisora, Di Toliane, Kenina, Kisuina, and Gelon Pamata, Sanga with Kambala Sobati, and Teleja, or Person Soberto, or Timbiso, or Tendi Onguardo. Tianjun Niva Shinduka. Di Tolia, Kariche to Guresana, give it to Toba Cuba last. Chima Penjegi, Soso Tonda to the Esogada. Chima Penja Soso Tonda Cartuere, Mondo Hadam, Nasola Martin, Lamico Machi to Vera, Kibuchungu. Oh, Kibundinda China, oh, Nasonga Tungele Tarwasa Maimba, Koya Tungele, Hadam Miller Soba, Led and Yamobashan watching Joatile Tarwache, Koya Tungele Tarwache. Oh, Tile Lagwache, Net, Rachi Butawasa Maimba. Pamarti Simja Tamje, Rana Tension we invest in Jengi Simja to some Tamjula. So, Pan Totem Gay, Tungedam, yes, on down, Koya Tungele Trawachi Tunge. Tawata Tamje Kim Besalam, good Tungenge. Nuba Yonsu Tongenge, Tab the Shiro Niga Tarshimbe, Sanje Jokoban Tabarsha, something, or Tende, Tanda, to do or what they do, but to go to Songara. Yeah. Wonder.
So here, the kind of life that we have right now, we must have accumulated in the past the sort of causes to have such a life. We must have engaged in ethics and generosity and patience and so forth. And so too, looking forward, it's important that we also continue to engage in these practices, holding to a kind of ethical conduct, engaging in generosity. And patience is particularly important because if we lack patience, then when we get angry, we destroy the roots of our virtue. When we have this kind of attitude that sees others as unpleasant and we engage with them in that way, we are likely to destroy any sort of positive, virtuous activity that we have done. And so we should have the kind of resolve thinking, I will guard ethical conduct. I will make sure that I engage in generosity and patience. And even if we have not, like in this life, we have from our previous efforts, gained the sort of conditions wherein we are able to develop our meditative concentration, whether we have actual concentration or not, to be able to focus and enough understand this is what I should be adopting, this is what I should be abandoning, and so forth. And we have the kind of intelligence to be able to discriminate between those because we have practiced wisdom in the past. So here, at the very least, we want to ensure that we gain such a good rebirth again in the future, whether that is just holding the kind of ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtues, abandoning any sort of harmful action toward others, or even maybe we have the opportunity to take vows of individual liberation or bodhisattva tantric vows. So we have this opportunity in this life right now to use that, as it says in the second line, for the benefit of beings, for the welfare of beings in this world. And at the very least, we want to ensure that we gain another good rebirth so we can continue to practice the Dharma. So the first level of the being of small scope is to think, with this kind of life, I'm going to ensure that I don't fall into the lower realms. But seeing that even if we are to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god, that's really not free from this suffering nature of samsara. So going beyond that, we think, I want to be freed from all of samsara. May I strive to get liberated from this cycle of existence. And even beyond that, we can see that, well, it's not just us who is in this kind of situation, but all of these other sentient beings who have acted toward us with such great kindness. We think, I want to be able to bring them to this state of Buddhahood. May I myself attain the state of perfect, complete enlightenment, perfect in knowledge and ability, and so forth, in order that I am able to bring other sentient beings to that state. So this is the kind of attitude that we should set, thinking that with this life, we are going to use this for the welfare of beings.
Oh yeah. Ta getting dilla pemba matu nasi, ta tanda kugab sambo tinde yebe ten dilia, so chene che tuye yoro, tuk tuye yoro. Te madruba che ten, te tawase, chendi chibu samloko, dili tentu tengen sunda chi samloko. Te jang tunda mato, shenda ke me samsa samloko chi tebe na. Ani chima penje tunda tutu marwa, getting dilla pemba matu na. De tabi kugab sambo chone, tanda dili yingne, chendi chibu tunda yingne. 시주 맹게더와 뭐 두스탁바리스도 땡갱이 삼마도 치마 펜제 삼로 매바이나 아니 만들어서 보라 걔든들라 치마 펜제래 친디 지부 통도라 저와 치마데 장릉부 예릉부 때도 계절와 걔인도 되게 첨부해서 그거라 걔든들라 펜바마도나 친디 안다 좀 가라죠 다 치수 마음바나야 디데테 토야테 걸레 가보레스 데카레스는 가는 좀 남주네 미케 초라야 샹라 초라서 미케 초라 공부시에 초라 계획 초라 공부시에 초라데 대소자 망샤 내성도 롱땡게리 치레 마도 데데 고급 상부 영향 가보레 성교하라 오야 티치라나
So if we don't use the kind of opportunity that we have right now, and often we come under the control of thinking like, well, this life will remain, it's going to be stable and here for a long time. We fall into this kind of grasping at permanence and get caught up in just the affairs of this life. But now, while we have this opportunity, as this verse says, if we don't use this, if we don't take advantage of it, then who knows what will happen in the future. This life is very short, but the kind of suffering and happiness of the future are quite long. So at the very least, we should be thinking about our future lives. And while we have this kind of state that is so difficult to attain, we should make an effort to put it towards something positive. We are, for the most part, more habituated to negative actions and thereby engage in non-virtue. But we should, having a kind of awareness of this, say, no, I'm going to use this very life in order to do something positive.
뭐야 어디 인도 다 된다 가서다 말아주 단다 빌리 토반데 빼 된다 전부 임버지 소소 삼로 고고도 자 전부 시버시 마음버 된다 전부 두게 이버지 된대 두게 된다리야 기부 총으로 지네 샤라 초아 봐야 기부 띵으로 지네 나오 냠바다 차차바다 담아 봐야 냠모 봐야로 기부 전부이나 아니 지금 셴벤 답베 셴지 봐 점발에서 와 대소리 창제 계속 단다 니리 메스나를 삼을 당고야라. 근데 미기 쪽에 지나 또 알아서 지시 처에 봐도 방기세 개라나야 또 스타일 지르바. 이나 니리 삼을 당선에 야가라. 니리 삼을 마다나 빼는 소마제나야. 소마제 저마제 참마제 미기 쪽 마제나야. 그 제베 띠바 요하는 마도 지금 빵배 겨게 요 말아 다제. kinder부 지나가 미세 말아. 그 미세 빵배 겨게 두 말아. 띠바요 말아. 겨요 말아. 다나 생각하죠. 다 스테이션 마세비나 띠바요 말아. 마도 겨게요 말아. 빵기 삼자. 들은 메시지 날이야 미겨와 주도 방향을 저와 지금 매서 신이그 템버 주기 섬. 아니 지금 오늘 직사 단계리네 건다 삼을 단데 들은야 샹레 저와 제마 템버치는 야부들인데 제ben에서 스스로 가고 로 근데 지키나시 공동하게 차도를 써버 거에 녀모 들이들이들 정말서 뒷방투수 야부청송 삼사 그 정말서 근데 삼단은 일이나 삼단 팽이도 용거라 소시 방바 정이 방바 참아 방배 팽이 용거라 때문에 다 계시셔야 맞은 또 스테이션에 팽이게 와 말아 제 손장 가라서 동발랑보이네 말랑보이네 일이 메시나리하고 기능 뚫려 뒤치에서 뚫려 주샤당고도 ting에만 가담벨라마도 뚫려서도 이마레르나 가르가르 총소서 이마 타부르 tin데네 솔라가르 무티고래 기름멘디 바차와 제바다 가르가르 장가게 담보도 바타부 코라 나고스네 르미 강게와래 니르니르 삼도다 뇨르chen 빠루치르 나고 뒤에체 메바차위와라 응아라도 다 사자는도 대셔되네 가리나 랑자 대르마도 건과드게요 마라 요한도에 삼르데 따바리스타데네 건조함멘도 시기요 마래 무슨 셈지 연된데 고 공발을 때네 고네 건도래와 어디지라나 야
So, right now we have this kind of life, and we should recognize that it is really very precious, and thereby we should use this for something meaningful. We should really recognize the value of it, and thereby not let it go to waste. At the level of the being of small scope, this is gaining a good rebirth as a human or a god in the future, abandoning the 10 non-virtues and engaging in beneficial activities for that purpose. And then the middling level thinks of all of samsara as being in the nature of suffering, and thereby applies to the antidotes, thinking about getting rid of this grasping at a self and all of the other afflictions that cause us to cycle within samsara. And going even beyond that is thinking about how can I benefit others, these beings that have been so kind to me? May I be able to become a Buddha in order to benefit them? And so, whatever sort of level we are at, it's really important that we call to mind, that we set an intention about these sorts of things. Just not engaging in non-virtuous actions doesn't mean that we are accumulating virtue. So, for example, like a dog or something isn't going around killing beings, but they aren't getting the kind of virtue of not killing because there's no intention there. If we don't think about this, if we don't set our intention, and in some ways we might like set an intention thinking like, oh, I'm never going to engage in any non-virtuous actions until I'm enlightened. But really we need to refresh this. We need to think about it on a daily basis in order to really develop our mind. Our mind develops through habits, through becoming accustomed to things. And so here we need to be able to see what we did with our mind, reflecting on the day, thinking, oh, I did this good thing. I did a positive, virtuous activity, and rejoice in that. Or we think, oh, I was able to abandon this. You see the benefits of abandoning that particular action and make a deliberate effort to do so. Then this is something that whether or not we have taken vows, even if we are just talking about like the 10 non-virtues, to at the beginning of each day, think about those, set our intention with regard to those is what is going to bring about the kind of benefit. As the Kadampa masters of the past talked about, we set that sort of intention, and then at the end of the day, we should reflect. What did I do? What sort of good things and bad things did I do? Like if at that time they might have been living in a cave and taking a piece of coal or something to make black marks for every negative action. And at the beginning of this exercise, the whole walls were like filled with black marks, but over time they're able to reduce that. This is how we work with our mind, but we have to think about it. We have to make that kind of intention and not just sort of like, oh, long term, but really refresh it on a daily basis and evaluate, see if we are making a difference in our mind.
Oh yeah. Oh, the Indu Kasura. Arantu Yana and the Kumdichi, the Chikum Chambada, Niji Chanjusin, Saba, Karikomba Inaya. Oh, the again, do they order. The same bit in the Pausha Shavi or never church to Dora. Namsada, Chikomba, Champachi, Niji, Namsan, get to Mara. Toma Mevananga, the Medicho de Comde Ora. Tina, Kaja Comna Keke, Medu Samsa, Mayana and some Diana and some time to combat on Rode Ora. Oh, the Indu Karsoda. Oh, the Yaki Medu Samsa Teo Marto. Jisam Ji Paucha Shavi in a Tesum Ji Chiba in a church, in the Tesum Chiba in a Tarves Sabi shitting by Songudua. Tarves Paucha could shit of things I took but Mosia Javiora. Kisoja Kochi. Yagen Ross Documentos, some the Kaja come the Titan Giomara, Kaja Samratana, Tesambi, Nuvasim between the Pasha, where Tison the Conda Payora. Oh, yeah, what to do sometimes in Bacha. That and that, oh, Mambush and Yangurode. Oh, this is Gasuda. Can you merely talk about the Tanda de Bachi with some? Tende Cheva in a social medicine dinner, the Wadi Ungora. They injure some. Churches do Chimatobajimado, Cedel Pendo Mangas and the Yansam Tangi Omara. Churches look as a Chendi Chibut and the church goes to the Shado, Timadira, oh, Tindo Carsoda. Chendelico Yongure, Pendi Junior Sanjay Tembasido. Tembas to Pugla, you are Chimatsiora. They were said the Chendel Sigora. Chendel in the country Chorching, I guess, or Chado, Chorching, Sawachi Mason. Chama Chizu, Najan, Yirin, Mason at the Samartana. And of course, Soso Pandeora, Soso Sempakiva, Namina Sempakiva, Tambun Namine Congressongo, Chambatsa or Congress Poyete, Soso Tessetines, and the Gacher Chipa, teacher we are to. Or Tison the Carsoda. Or Tinder Samartana, Tanda. Can you million to the Tanda and the Bachi some? And to show Jang Jingol, the Chisha. Lulan, the Lulango Caresta, Tanga, Shaw, Candolation, Belenji, Lutrin Malana, Cadulan Sanashi. There's you million did that we always told the Sosa Kuga chair, the chair, Yavati, Tawastanda, Mevatan, member, Lutrin Malana Cadula, Tirim Maja Caduce, Scuda. Oh, then there's Samartane, any Carsoda. Oh, Gawachima, Ladami, combating the Bartovacha. There's a Maimba, Yamu, Tendo Pambeleta, Yamu, Shawan, the Junior Rameba. Kichichego Tele Tawachi, Teza Maiba, Tala Kadinchi, Simja Tamje, Decadinchi, Decadin Mechese, Yomar, Gawa Tame Basonda, Tamje Kadinchi in Bese, Teda Tamje Laya, Tabata Tamje Kimbalangu, Tungank, Nuba Yanganki, Sambucha, Parchimba, Champagne Samla, Tabe Shancheba. So, any shame which are Landor Genetam, the Tarchimba Sanji, you go on to Tobarcha, Techedo. And the Tekula Labeche to Taba the Sambo Combachigism, Tetan Chunigism, Kulum set and the Samba shoes, yeah, they do it.
So, whatever it may be that we are applying our mind to, like love and compassion and so forth, whenever we engage in these things, whenever we think about them, we are putting down imprints in our minds. We are creating habits, but we can't expect this to be something that brings about an immediate change. It's not like just flipping a switch, but rather we should have the understanding that it is with every reflection, with every time we put our minds to that, we are creating the kind of imprints that will eventually make that sort of change. We shouldn't have this thought of like, oh, I can't improve, I can't develop this kind of attitude. We can't also expect that just reflecting upon love and compassion a few times is going to bring about a radical change. But however much we think about these topics, however much we develop that, we are like putting down that kind of foundation. However much we reflect upon love and compassion or impermanence or whatever it might be, we are creating those kinds of imprints that really will have an impact on our mind. And so we shouldn't have this idea that our practice of the Dharma is just for this life, but we also shouldn't have the idea that it's only going to bring us benefits in future lives, but rather the Dharma is referred to as the source of benefit and happiness. Benefit referring to the kind of long-term benefits that come from the Dharma in our future lives beyond just this life alone. Because really, for it to be Dharma practice, we can't just be thinking about this life alone. But we also have, through our practice of the Dharma, we bring about happiness, as in we bring about a kind of mental peace that comes in this life right now by reducing our kinds of afflictions. If we have less pride and less anger and less jealousy and so forth, we are happier, we experience the kind of happiness in this life. And when we reflect upon love and compassion and so forth, we begin with our family, with those that are right around us. And by creating that kind of harmony and good relations with those around us, it's not just some future result that is beneficial, but rather it's right now that we experience a kind of benefit from this. So again, we should recognize how precious the opportunity is that we have right now in this life, in this body that we have taken up at this moment. As it is explained with the example of someone who is sort of crippled, or they didn't have any legs, and there was a wild ass running by, and they fling themselves onto this wild ass and are singing a song, and people are going, well, why are you singing? And he's like, well, when else am I going to have this kind of opportunity? Look what I have right in this moment. And so that's the kind of attitude that we should have, really reflecting upon the life that we have with a sense of it being so incredibly precious. And with that, we then want to use this in order to benefit ourselves in the future, and not just ourselves. I mean, we begin with the kind of thought that, well, I definitely need to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god. But not just that, I want to get out of samsara entirely, this cycle of suffering, and thereby I'm going to make efforts at getting rid of the afflictions. But it's not just me who is in this situation, but these greatly kind sentient beings, and not just one or two have been kind to me, but given that there are countless previous lives, there's really not a single being I can point to who hasn't been kind to me, who hasn't shown me great kindness. So thereby, I'm aspiring to become the kind of being who is able to bring about the highest happiness for all of these sentient beings, a fully enlightened Buddha who has removed all faults and developed all good qualities. And so it is in that way that we really take advantage of this moment that we have right now, and recognize that every sort of habit we are creating is something important.
Oh yeah. 당한 저 내려서 그래서 어디 조사서 다들 졸로가도 실락산도 다네 녀와 렘벌 싸워 싫어.
No.
공부 루두고 성도와 다단다 다음에 버셔요라. 가래서도 시행을 쳐와다 녀모다 강가 용사게 시대 간에 용기도 선행아 삼남중아주 삼르지도와 나나 삼두장아 라와로치 예배 삼르 코고도와 오 텐데 남중아주 삼르 코로나 신경아티 요마르다 스티셰기와래 아 삼가마체네 나이 삼사네 나조세네 콘조세 다 강가 용기와라 오 텐데 남주 삼대나 신가도 요마레스 와라 나조 삼두 가르삼도 소보 그 태도 요마레 소와 대화 동에도 태도 그 요마르 나삼 코란 로가치 삼르 땅그도와 오 텐데 같이 요마르와 코란 랑위네 현다도 냠도 dom네니 슬파 다샹게치 남샤치 샤고르 마토치 텐데 요마라 어디 매버데 삼르땅고레 송거라 다이나야 델리아 디 매버스든 디 커실라임바 나버가 다 케랭게 마레세 데 텐산 데지셴게 자가도 카셰 야부셰도 카셰 고마즈셰도 Nambole tayo mara ta mene kyo kanda silingire ya kyo ngachi yore si yore sera. Asanje chumde de tayo mayur kecho sheyo mara sera. Ya te na she kar soda. Jiten cheba bo yo mayur ya tene kecho son yo mara sera. O tende she do. No to kashe kashe le tayo mayur le ma jeb son sa yore. Kapta tule kansa di sambada kanga kende yose na madi mes na madi kyo yone nego kaga shushan ya yora. Tende yora mato chidan ko ta mesi sebu che sungu wara. Ta mesi de rangwe, takchi rangwa chen de rangwa ne tube ta me. Tene takwa sambi ta yesi, titu nyangi re se, chamba nyingi kongu re se, tabo tungele tarko re sungu wara, ta yore. Chiriba dewa na shen ta rangwa tu tube nganzu namji lo senje na samba na shen ki nga tende yo ma re sungu wara. O ti na shen, chikten cheba bo yo ma re sungu wara. Tende yana chuni kone kwa kuzi kuran she tetu jeba bu me she ge wara. Salu jambe do kapso. O tome maribe kone la nyam kanga jungsa shidire da se. Nga sani kewe le sani yaga dosu kanga mi kewe le sani tuwa kanga yungo re songde. Jeba bu yo mara songa. Jeba bu shenda she ne tetu she kwe yo mara. Tende yana chuni kone kwa kuzi she tu zanji ten jeba bu kaga yo wara. Salu jambe do kapso ti kaga doa. Ne ta sabi fatamne sabi de ne nyugu chigi yuwe samsamla kwa mare se gyujin sangsana kuna ke yungure se te re 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 chana songudwa te jigden cheba bo yo mare se lo yo angon du tan dikiran di ko di che wo senge yo mare se gyujin tende sosu de sangsana debu de yungure songu yora sa cheba bo meba to seba chen songu yora ti pajo de cheba bo yo se ta yo senge de la neba che tanda kapde che tanda songu yo mara 다 여세대 경강가 연구도 세팅하고 삼을 따고라 연구도 연구를 따고라 다들 삼을 따대 지바보 여세도 지바보 현대제 지구의 삼대 소소 제야대 소송 두어라 현대제 르게 현대 전개 연대된 되라 아니 야서라 몰람 지역권의 가르치군 제소라 그 연의 강가 제셔라 나라 중에나 소소 내가 연의 강가 야타로 당사로 등도 소소 말아 어이 마다스다야 어디지로 비한디스
So here, then picking up in the text, we'll begin with this quotation on 128 from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, where he says, a self that is different from the appropriated aggregate is not possible. If it were different, then it would be observed without appropriation, but it is not observed. So here we are talking in the context of selflessness, and we have this thought of an I. All of us has this sort of sense of an I that we think exists, and it somehow seems as though it is like separate and apart from the various aggregates upon which it is designated. Like we think like my body, there's this I that possesses the body, or my mind, and there's this sense of this I that is somehow different from the appropriated aggregates. Now, here, again, we have been talking about how the Buddha was famous for teaching selflessness, and there are some who have a proper kind of understanding of what it means to be selfless, and there are others who really don't understand. They fall into a kind of misunderstanding. And so we see that the Buddha teaches in accordance with the various needs of beings. There are times when he talks about there being a self, and in the context of for those who might fall into an extreme of nihilism, he talks about, well, this self needs to develop love and compassion. There is a self who cycles in samsara, and we want to get liberation from that. And so much of this is taught in order to refute the idea of there being some kind of creator. As is explained in the Rice Seedling Sutra, there is no creator, but rather we only proceed through the links of dependent origination. We have our karma that is driven by ignorance and so forth. And so this kind of process describing the way in which beings are dependently originated refutes that idea of there being some kind of creator, or being some kind of like thought motivation behind a being creating other things. Like, for example, as it describes in the Rice Seedling Sutra, a sprout, for example, doesn't need to have the thought like, oh, I'm going to come about, but rather when all of the causes and conditions are present, you have the seed and all of the other sort of conditions, then a sprout will come about. And so here, we need to investigate for ourselves. We need to look, what is the self that exists? How does this self exist? Is there an existent self? This is something that we need to investigate and analyze for ourselves. If it is the case that like everything that we experience, someone else is just done for us, or the improvement of our mind or anything like that is under the power of someone else, then I guess we just would need to make prayers, right? And they would change things for us. But here, if we look and investigate, we can see that there is no such creator. And here we need to look at the way that the self actually does exist.
Oh yeah, the so that. Yeah, Kashi something you so come that somebody Pashada Tende Keba Yorwa. Ya Kashi Yanti Jide Chebabu Yona, Yaga Tende Samlu, Yaga Kurkuyora. Kage Songechi Manadim Chili, Songechi, some Tilpa, Chichi, Debachashi, Koran, Tendo Yora. That under Dilkas, Pachoti Koran, I kept your suggestion, Tilpa, Keshane, Yagachuna, Dugachuna, Congress to Vesidua. Chebabu Compare degree share, Karina share of Che, Dugachune, T. to very share the what, Tendo the Diviora. That Sujo de Chibabo Yoma, so Chevure share Tondara, so in the water Hakon and Diviora. Touch it to teach Chevure share Yoma, so the consensus come the Sambardoa. Chidi, Shandaje Chiviri Samine, so could you jago, so Nanzinda, Tanzinda, Nansan Samoko Ranja Shaviora. Tiranja Shana and Shanda to the new driver, Condo Tabati Chene, Tombani Magon, Zawan and Meva Soto Maresigora. You also the Kane, you could do till some Tane, Tayo Mares and Chicken Chibabos and the Sosu, which you Chevati Zochivres, Tangi Target Zore, Sosu Zore, so some Tanda, Sosu Lima, which you Sange Wange, Sange Ungris, the Sosu and Ganshan Bushlegua. Titandalia Sungura. Ya Kashi Samu teach Pachu was a Pajo de Tane, teach and Digora. Nambala Kashi da yes Pumbungaga de da in Sigora. Tapa Chibu round at the yoga Sundenge Omara. Shambadayan Pumbugan and Namshi da in Sero. Kunshis engage Loga, Simbi Kundu, Nengage da in certain day order. So, Koso da Messi. Pumbudine da membership, Teleloso da Mana, came into some sort of Jigna can table Mendona San table manner. And that says Namshi, Tabar Shidro and get Simchidua, Titare some Nendigora. Tikelling a number Mambuori, Tingarazo, Tita in some Nendigor, so Madena. Oh, that under the Kanganota carrying Gorasena. Kumbuta Marwa Sobuchida, Shebe Chachiniora, Sobucha Kayanda Marichera. Shimgicha, so and the Shebe Chakayanda Marichera. Minduachi, English dinner. And it came my engage till a loss to your best and water, tell your marichera. And it turns Zuzu says Medua, and Shigiora. So the Zuzu says Medua. Oh, Teneta Kage make a chance on some Giora. Shiora, Tishes are Pumbulet and Shendo. Touch years some Giora, Yene Abudu some Giora. Sobo Mare, Sem Mare, Rene Mare, in a till a loss of Nagitaji years and a Tijiba Mare. Bulletin beta said, "Oh, Tindia, similar sugar manner, naked sugar manner. They could kill and do the Ranguneta Yores, Cushion of City Tare, said, Simbi Yishi, Junti Tare, said, well, what in day? Yeah, did you love that this amount? I said.
So here we all have kind of differences in terms of our dispositions, our inclinations, our desires, and so forth. And so we need to understand that these ideas that are presented should accord with the kind of dispositions and sort of desires of various beings. For example, for some, the idea of like a creator God is the best kind of teaching. This is what will be of benefit to them. If they sort of are able to put their trust in that particular figure, and maybe when difficult circumstances arise and so forth, they're able to bear with that because of that kind of belief that they have. And so then, as opposed to that, I mean, and again, this is because because of the various kinds of inclinations and dispositions, mentalities of various beings, that we have these different kinds of teachings. But from the Buddhist perspective, it's really taught that you need to take care of yourself, that you are responsible, you are your own master. Whereas if someone is following a teaching where there is an idea that there's some sort of self or there's some sort of creator, maybe they don't take responsibility for themselves. Now, some might need to believe in the idea of a self in order to, as a sort of temporary means, and in that way, they might be able to reduce certain kinds of afflictions. They might be able to reduce their anger or their attachment, and so forth. But unless one really gets at the idea of there not being a self, at this idea of selflessness, you're leaving the sort of root cause of all of the problems untouched. So when it comes to really accepting this and accepting that idea of selflessness, it comes with a great responsibility. We are then responsible for ourselves. So here, as has been identified, a self that is different from the aggregates is not a suitable kind of a proposition, something that is entirely different. But that we see that even within the Buddhist schools, there are those that would say that, well, it is actually all of the aggregates all together, that is the self. And there are others that look at the mental consciousness and say, no, the mental consciousness, that is the self, or the foundational consciousness, that is identified as the self. But if it is the case that for someone, maybe they are uncomfortable with the idea that, well, things are selfless in the sense that there's nothing that you can point to as being the self. It's something that is merely designated. If that causes a kind of fear or trepidation, then maybe thinking that the mental consciousness is the self, or identifying the foundational consciousness is the self, that is temporarily the best kind of solution for them. So when we look at this idea of I, it is something that, again, is designated on the basis of these aggregates. So we could have two sort of parts to that. There's the body, the physical body, and then there's the mind. And it's fairly easy to identify that, well, the body is not the I, is not the self. But if it is the case that when we then say, oh, well, the mind can't be the self either, that there's actually sort of nothing that we can point to, for those that are temporarily unable to bear that, who would get afraid, it is okay for them to, at that point, accept that there is, like, the mental consciousness is the self, or the foundational consciousness is the self.
Oh yeah. Dangan ju de lo win da bo do. De da ya za shi le se do. Da ne nyawa len ba le shen do te ba ni ma yin su do. Da de su ra. Pumbu nga yo ra so gi pumbu cho do shi number shi pumbu nga yo ra. O da ne nyawa len be pumbu nga le shen do yo ma re su ngo shen da che. Da de ba la na shi ngo bo se bu na shi la ba yen yin na shi ko ra ka ga che si do ra. Ngo shen do yo ma re su. Da ne nyawa len ba le shen do te ba yin ma yin se. Pumbu nga bo de sha te ma yin ge chi da chi yo ma ro. Da ne nyawa len ba le shen do te ba yin ma yin se. Shen do yo ba yin na ke de shen na le me ba so yo re na so do ma. Pumbu nga bo te le su da she ba da ro te zu le lo so da chi yo na si go ra. Ke de shen na le me ba so yo re. Ane da ngo jin de pumbu chi ka ya ro chi so ne. Char ne ane te le te ne da si pa da go do te da ko ma ro si go ra. Nga ju mere thon da so po thon so te chi chi re te ta shi re te te do re te ta re te pa la re si go ra. So po thon de so po le te ne pa da go do go re chi thon so na. Palang go re chi thon da nga ma re chi yu yu che so na. O te te re sha sam ta go do. Go de palang ke re o ma ra. Go char shi che ne te palang re sta go ra. O te do ka so re. Tinte ta go me do si go ra. Kura kare yimba de ta pa de palang re se. Munje che go ra. So po le te ne. So po palang ma ra. Palang ma ra ne ani so po le te ne. De palang che du sa so po palang yin sam ge o ma ra ko. So po cha ne o de palang do sam ge ra. Kare se ge ma se te kare kor ke o ma ra ta cha sha ki ra ma do. Ji ge chen de la ga re da se no ko re sto ne. Ji to o re sha ta cha sha ma da. Chedikari Lagare Sigos, Colton Lavsasana, the Yambeson charge, you didn't tell you. That's all. Teletene Kuta Nalo de Sada Kunda Yosaki, this on the tail Havan cigars. Touch a jura. What in the Pumbulation, do you know Pumbunzi Charmaguacha, Koran Tata, Munzichi has got a tea or Marisora. Children at Tangazo Sobolate Tata. Social option, social sobolate, sometimes somebody make it out, there is somebody give me the son. There Nagidu Samsa, Susu Nazati Shison, and Nagidu Samsa, Soa than the shit and the shit, Tindil Ten Patagua, Condu said, no, during us, Condu Sako, Yamendesa, my trouble ship was Samsa Tegdo, Condu Tanga, get a trado than dressing the Tuzukanga Dashi Tora, Tuzul Ten Patagura. The Pumbule Sento Tashiona, Mo Shensiona, Tabalana Shene, the Tarendi Panarendi, Mombure Sebures, Kaka Kagangicia Yokura. Timidua, so sometimes the Yomara, Migsuta de Yomara. Jena, Pumbule Tension, but I Yomara Sigora. Yeah. Down in your island, Balashando Tabanima, get a shando Yona, and the shando Kagachene, Suni Nase, Pumbusona Madu Vachaja. Sonju Yogura, Munzingu Yogura, Pumbuchara Madova Chichara Yogura, Pumbu Munzimbala Madova Shandashi Kurkadul Munzichi as Yogura, Zihashi Yogura, Timido Asigura, or Dickas Lapsada, or Dichi Lapsana.
So here, as it says in this quotation from Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way, so a self that is different from the appropriated aggregates is not possible. If it were different, then it would be observed without appropriation, but it is not observed. So here, these 5 aggregates are form, feelings, discrimination, mental formations, and consciousness. If it were the case that the I, the self, were of a different nature, a different essence than those appropriated aggregates, then it would have to be something that is totally separate. Something like when we have like an ox and a cow, or a blue and yellow. So when we think about it, we can't find something aside from the aggregates. That we can identify as being the I, the self, because it is the case that really the I is just designated upon the aggregates. Like, for example, if we see like the head of an ox, we can say, oh, there's an ox. It's not as though we think that the head is the ox, but rather on that basis, we are able to designate something that, oh, there is an ox. Or like I can say, this is a temple. And then, just by showing the door, and we know that there is, a space inside with various images and so forth. And that is enough for the existence of the temple. We can say that decisively. And we can look at it and see that really it's just a convention. If we try to point out, well, where exactly is this? We're not able to find it. But just that level of saying this is the temple designated on a particular basis, that suffices for its existence. So when we look at our own self, when we say like, oh, I am sick, or oh, I am unhappy, I am angry, and so forth, it is on the basis of one of those 5 aggregates, of one of our feelings, or a mental consciousness, or a body. If it were separate, if it were the case that we had this I, that we're totally separate and apart from the aggregates, then we should be able to observe that. We should be able to see something that is apart from those aggregates, or speak about a self independent from the aggregates. So we could identify and look at, okay, over here's the aggregates and over here is the self, but that is not the case.
Oh, yeah. That did it. The young Randi Ngoma Namjin Devatar Sidwa. That Dagagi Karsura. Tutamawa Shenda Shena, Tawa Chibu Rameta Sera. Pumbule Tension Beta is a Pumbungati, Be Logache de la Losta Yusera. In this Shetua, this Shaja. The number Sanja, but Tomba Sanja, some day they change you in a ya Kondu Karsivarsana. Ngoma Namjes, Ngobo, Ramune Yore, Ngobo Tembatuba Yore, Roa, O Tezu Sengetezu, Devatar, Nyoalembe Pumbule. Shen ta yoba miro dike lingyo mara nyawalimbe pumbule pe ngo tate pumbunga de logasha kura ta de pe logachi yose tapala na she kaga yose dike lingyo mara nangbe tuda mo suja ngo ma namje doba tara nyawalimbe pumbule shen ta yoba miro ese chirube doba tesura te rungu mara ese ta takwa ta teta pumbu namle kanshi rangwene trube da yino nya pumbu nane chi yo kore te yoga te nga yore te nane chi te da yin kore sam yore te men tena da mena ane te da kawa yore sam tena nga ga de da yin singe yora pumbu nga ga da de hachi tena ne yi ki nam shi ki tyun de da re sar hachi te ma re tena lo kunshin nambar shi ba singe nam yu ne ko sem jing de tai gyamzu na shi pe tenpo chi te ten ge shi yore te re kunshi namshi se kewa maju mekewa maju yugyun dhaba shida me shinge yungu dhaba shida me ke meke loma maju kwe sem amachi yoro o di taare se kunshi namshi taare se tinte se yora kumbu nane chi yogore se sogo ta shibe nane chi yogore mato ane menduwa tile shendani wa mara tinte samge yore se ra miro kumbu namle kanshi rangune trube ta yino nyamna se kumbu nane chi ta yin kukudo se kumbule tuen shenpe pe kaka shen taa chidi yo mara tesi na. Tedana taa di nyawa lembe pumbu namdran samdu sebe. Taan di uma ba taa tezu lu na shinchi shegi wara. Di rang lu che di uma be lu na shinchi shegi wara. Ya uma ba tezu ngobu rangune yoba ma otsul ya shegi wara. Tedana taa di nyawa lembe pumbu namdran samdu se. Ini taa taa pumbu nga chikwa re songa che ra. Taa sinedra, pumbu nga sinedra, pumbu sinedra chikwa re te tuwa si wara. Tanda de taa pumbu nga de nyawa langza che, taa de lemba bos che, tinte shaa kore, teke me toa pumbu nane, taa re de nane, nyawa langza ke nane, taa re de toa. Teta na taa nyawa lembe pumbu namdran sandu se bas. Pumbu taa si ming me ra taa ma to tanda chikwa re toa, ming namdran sa re toa se ra. Inbe, taa rangshin ke ye bara, mawa tome ba jurshin se. Pumbu namdran sandu se bas. 다 랑신기 여버 마와 때문에 봐. 다 랑신기 매세. 지난해 전에 니 매세 때 지금 도섬 거라. 일단다 도서라. 간동을 마서 거라. 다 이노 냠나 때다나 다디 녀알레베 풍부 남장 좀도 세배. 다랑 루시거라. 세배 다 랑신기 여버 마와 때문에 봐 유르신에세. 아니 다시 랑신기 여세. loga she me duwa kumbu yo te ta re to ma do ta si loga me duwa she ra kumbu na ne na nyawa lemba bo da nyawa lang ji ni ke sha ko me duwa si go ra yo ba ma te me ban ju she she kumbu ni ta da kumbu ta re de to kumbu na ne ta kumbu da rang ge ngo yo te be rang shi chi yin na se ta de kumbu da rang shi rang ge ngo yo te be rang shi chi yin na se go ra rāngi ngōyō tūpa te kōnsi ngōyō mā kē līngi wā tīka sī wā rā. Rāshī chī na, nye lēngi phōngbō gyōng chē bā tā, chī yī na sī wā rā. Tā phōngbō tā rāngi ngōyō tūpa rāshī chī yī na sī. Nē phōngbō sāba yōngu rā, sōpo rā chī na mē lū, sōpo sāba yōngu rā. Nē yā tē tsō sō na, tī tsō rā yō mā rā. Yāng shendā chī kio lā sō na phōngbō sāba yōngu rā sōpo. Pē kākā yōngu dōwa. Tī yinā nī kā sō rā sō na, rāngi ngōyō tūpa rāngshī chī yinā nye lēngi phōngbō gyōng chē bā tā sō. Nye lēngi phōngbō tī gyōng chē yō rā, sēndi rā shī sō na phōngbō gyōng chē rō rā rāng nyam dō yō mā. Yāng chī mā kio lā sō phōngbō sāba shī lā ngō rā, pē sāba sā kia ngā mē gyōng mā rā. Nye lēngi phōngbō gyōng chē bā tā sō. Phōngbō gyōng kāshī tā dōng gyō rā sō kī. Yāna phōngbō nā nē chīk tēne tā dōng gyō rā sō kī. Phōngbō kinchi chidar chē bā tā phōngbō kāntē kinchi chē bā yinā tēnā shē tā dē kinchi chē gō rā. Nē phōngbō sāba lē dō gō tō. Ngā mā kio ngā mā mēngē, gyōng chāna mēngē sāba chī lē gō tō. Tēnā tā dē sāba lē dō rā. Nē ngā mā tā shīmā nī dē dāwa mēngē rē chā gō tō, gyōng kī dāwa mēngē chā gō tō. Kinchi cheba phōngbō sōpō kinchi cheba nā shēngi sātō mēba chā rō ngā mā tī kyō mēba chā sāba kī gō rā o tēnā shī chā gō rē sō rā kinji cheba tawata. Shaya, nyawa lanje pumbuda, nyawa lembabu, chi imbara tawa sukyani. Ani nyawa lanje pumbudeda, lembabu nini chigre sonasi wara. Ani di songen deda, lengen deda, pumbu lanje deda, nyawa lembabu de chigina, ni cheba boda, shawe yu tingi chiba chawi wara. Ati ina zaken dozo, zama sudu zane ko tingi chigin batandu shari, tinde yungdo. O tiba de chido na, mando cheson. Yeah.
So here, there are those non-Buddhist schools, other kinds of tenant schools that assert that there is some sort of permanent, unitary, and autonomous self. So it's not logical for there to be some kind of self apart from the aggregates, whether it is those that assert some kind of permanent, unitary, autonomous self, or as it says here, furthermore, it is not logical to assert, as do the Buddhist essentialists, and that would be those who assert that there is some kind of essential true existence, a self that is separate from the appropriated aggregate. So here, there can't be some sort of self that is apart from, aside from the appropriated aggregates. Again, that's not something that can be observed. And so any sort of self then needs to be with the aggregates, or like among the aggregates. So there are those, and I'll read this next sentence, any self presumed to exist from its own side among the aggregates would in fact be merely a synonym for the aggregates. So thus to say, as an essentialist would, that there is an inherently existent self would be senseless. So here, again, as it says that if it is the case that some that the self is among the aggregates, is sort of like within the aggregates, as some assert, either the mental consciousness or the continuum of the mental consciousness, or something like the sort of stable basis for the clarity of mind, this fundamental consciousness, they would assert that, well, it has to be something among the aggregates that is the self. Now, if it were the case, then from the Madhyamaka position, those two would become just the same. So therefore, it would be like the self would be sort of like a synonym for the aggregates, because there's no self that's separate from the aggregates. But if they're the exact same, if the self is the exact same thing as the aggregates, then it becomes a mere synonym. And the sort of idea of the thing that is appropriated, these aggregates, and then the appropriator, the self, would collapse. It would be senseless then, thus to say, as an essentialist would, that there is an inherently existent self would be senseless. So here, then if the aggregates were the self, or were the self itself, or the self and the aggregates were essentially existent and of one intrinsic nature, then it would follow that in whatever way the aggregates were produced and perished, whether the appropriated aggregates were destroyed or a new continuum of the aggregates arose and so on, the production and perishing of the self would have to be just the same. So here, if there is then nothing separate and apart aside from the aggregates that is the self, but rather they have to exist, the self must be among the aggregates, and as essentialists would assert that they have to be sort of truly existent, then we would have the problem that the aggregates, as they are produced and perish, as we can see, like the aggregates of this life are something that will end at the end of this life and will take up new aggregates. But that would be untenable for them to be part of the same continuum. They couldn't be related to the same continuum and have this kind of essential existence, identity, And so the one who would take up those aggregates and the aggregates themselves would collapse if it were the case that the self were the aggregates. But if the self is something apart from the aggregates, or it's identified with one continuum of the aggregates and then that perishes, there would have to be a new beginning. So as it points out here, that if the aggregates and the self are the same, then the production and perishing of the self would have to be just the same. So here, the one who takes up those aggregates, if it's like a human in one life and then a god in the next life, if those are essentially truly existent as such, they couldn't be members of the same continuum. So these are some of the faults that would arise.
Oh yeah. That is actually long time ago. Tadaya Zashile Sudo. Tada Lele Shema Yisudo. Da days or the Rangwine to be da days. Rangwine Yebe da days. Nyawale be Pumbule. No Shen to be Tabalana Shingo Seven Shikaga Yomare Sigora. Tada Lele Shema is Nyelengi Pumbu Sigora. And it Shema is a da disora. Rangwine to be da days or Tanda Rangwine to be Kaling get the Nyam to Keshe Yora. Ta rangwine yona rangwine drube ta de ene nyawale be phumbule shendo be ngo thade che ta bala na ngo bo se na shin che yo ma re se ora ta da le shen ma ye se ngo thade shin yo ma re se tene nyele nye ja me se ene nye rangwine drube ta de nyele ji phumbu na ne nyele ji phumbu de drube se te ma re se ra tene nyele nye ja me rangwine drube ta de Nyeleji Pumbu Nane Suda Chiga Mare, Soan Dushi Nafsi Pumbu Da Chiga Mare Sera, Shaya Mare Chiga Mare Sera. Kita Lele Shema, Tene Nyele Nija Mense, Shetas, Tati, Tene Nyele Nija Mense, Tene Nyele Rao Tade, Nyele Pumbu Yena, Nyele Pumbu Da, Dani Chigredura. Ni Taginashi Pumbu. Savachi Kesuna, Kungama Mengenge, Kiwangama Mengenge, Pumbu Kun Savachi Lexona, and the Tade Savachi Languda. And the Takiwaningama Kun to the young member Chavdo, Ta Sava Sava Leori. Oh, Tindu Chavudo. Teta Lene Shema is pet Shema Resa, Motion, Yena, Pumbu Tezuki, Kiwata, Jikbata, Nebala, so Chawachira, Sobu Chawachigre, Swag Chawachigre, Kondo Chawachigre, Grand Dressing Bureau, Tato, Tezuchi Legachi, Dalke Kawayomare. When you pay Kavara Tapana Nashira. In the Tal Chawache Manga Chavre. Sobun Rosana Soches and a Tag Soche Mare. No, Sobu Kujajan Rosana Tardugama, Sobul Mares Nasana. Ta nagi omara, ta le chao mebare ndore, ta kinji kichiye meba, ta takwe sindu ke lega menge chandro ta. Nga samsa nga dugi, nga degi samsa log miyu yi nga di lega chiye me shinge namga tongbe sindu, takwe sindu chiliya, nga su samde ti samgi marwa se. Nga nagi, nga chagi, nga yabu koye, nga tupu koye samgi ora. O tindi, ta pumbu ni pe shen na, ni pumbu Chawa Cheba te Sama, Kiwada, Jikwada, Kiebala, Soba, Kiwala, Soba, Nawala, Soba, Tezu, Sama de Dog Chawan do Mare. Sem Kondo Sasuna, Ta Kondo Sayo Mare. Ra. Sem Gene, Yange Chesuna, Ta Yange Chigio Mare. Coca Keva Yomara, Coconut, Ganga Rasia, Mumbu Seven Nashira, Tapala Nashira, Chito Yomara. And Ta de Keke Pemedonge, Sawata, Chawa Menge, Yana Tomba, Ravura Nashi. Kagameriana Chitas, Latawachi, Yusher, Penny Tachi, Longche, that in the cake machine Chadura, or teaching with Tadalene Shen in a Swada, Shemares, Yeleko Mare, Pumbuda China, Niatama Bure Dure, Netaginashi, Pumbu Sava Sava ladies, Joangamane, Dirikiwata, Shimadia, Kiwa Tune Dram Show, Sobo Sava Sava Leonguda. Oh, did you let me?
So again, there would be many faults, such as the consequence that the aggregates that are appropriated and the self that is the appropriator would be the same, as have been described. And then Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way states, thus, the self is not different from the appropriator, nor identical to the appropriator. Here it isn't as though like the essentialists assert some kind of existence from its own side. If we have aggregates and then a self that are both existent from their own sides, then they become something totally separate. So we would have like an ox and a cow, and or blue and yellow that can be identified totally independently of each other. But it's not, yeah, and I'm not sure on this. So it's also not identical to the things that are appropriated. So here, as we have seen, it's not the case that the self could be totally separate and apart, distinct from the appropriated aggregates, but nor is it just those appropriated aggregates alone. If it were the case that the self is the aggregates, in the same way that we say take on a new form, we take on new aggregates with a new rebirth, then that would mean that there's a new self of a totally new and different nature. So here, it is the case that the self is designated on the basis of the various aggregates, but as is being established here, it's not something wherein the self is identical to the aggregates, nor is it totally separate and apart from the aggregates. If it were the case that it were totally separate and apart from the aggregates, then we couldn't speak of like, oh, I am moving, because that's the form aggregate which is doing that, or I am angry, I am sick, all of those kinds of things. Basically, the self would become impotent. It's totally devoid of any kind of function. Our aggregates have the ability to carry out various functions and activities, but our self, if it is disconnected from those aggregates, it would be sort of like something like inert space. We wouldn't have any kind of relationship between the aggregates, our body and mind complex, and this so-called self. And so all of the activities of the aggregates would be like totally unrelated to the I, to the self. There would be no sort of benefit or harm that came from the aggregates and then the self. And so that would sort of lead us to say, well, okay, then the self is just this permanent thing that doesn't really do anything, that doesn't have any functionality or doesn't cause any benefit or harm. So that's really not in a reasonable kind of position to take. But at the same time, if we have a kind of self that is, and then as the second part says, nor is the self then identical to the appropriator. So I'm not, here, neither is the self then just the aggregate. We've seen the faults that would come from trying to identify and say that the self just is those very aggregates upon which it is designated. So it can't be something totally separate and apart because of the lack of relationship, but nor could it be just the exact same thing. If that were the case, then the I, the self, would have no continuity. There would be no continuum of that, because of the perishing of the aggregates would mean that then the self has also perished, and so forth.
Oh yeah. Oh, that lele shema isirwa. Rangwine trube shema rese. Shena, but chichile tuba meba draw mare. Tabalana shikuni draw the meb sadore. Rangwine trube shena, demit shed and dore. Draw. That lele shema is. Shayinani, chichil do mare, pumbu chow chaba, dog chow chaba, do mare, tade, dog on the boat, and dress on the shadow, leg by mega shadow. Then a yelling yeja mese, Rangwine to be china, yelling pumbu yena, and a young yelling pumbu sobo, saba saba kikdo, Kundi Kawangamani Umadua, Yanti Chasana, Kyo Chamandaya, Yele Pumbu Saba Yungurape. Dinashi Daatim Joangamane, Shima Kun Tuche, Kon Jurkicha Yoya de Rigimara, Ti Kurigio Mara, Kun Chima Rigio. Then Yelen Yame, Yelen Pumbu Yinani, Yelen Pumbu da Chigre, Tina round to be Chigina, and a Pumbu Chawa Chidar Chevanashi Tao Chawa Chegura, and a Pumbu Meme Sartura Chonchina, Joangama Bebasa China, Tade Joangame Kune Matuti Mayumba Savasi Lekura. Oh, Tikan Yodesi. The Tanda de Tombani Shegura. Shuna Shag in Medabada, Tunga, Chambada, Nichi, Chanju, Saint Tonyum Singakanga, Chegum Jare, Chegum. Tambope de Tombani Chegum Chigora, T. the Marati, Netkandu, request some time, Cheba Chigora, or Tenetati Medoa, some to Chena Comgiora. Mangcha Chegum Shuna, Tashina, the Tambo to Gwenet, Jogum Janya Chedewara, to the Loga Kotugura. The troops on it, and they don't buy it at the Chebachidoni. She knew Yona, they told her how don't Chebach in the pay of Chavara. Tit and Dalia Comgora, she knew to the quiet. Or Timado Cochita, she knew something as a temple jajan, they need to send in the Shavachina, Sanjera, Samgera. Mother Tico, Hatserum talking as a Mecumbe, Gagana, Hatserum Bushashivara, Hatserum Buchas. Thing is a temple jagger someday. Shibada Yoba Sumi Lato Susukyo to Tambuki, things in a current that Sebu Cheche, Namgata, Namshata, Messis, Dushim, Mimi Yora, or Tendene Degua. So till it can I things in the temple show off. In a team Mekumba next to the till my give show cigar. The things in Janyamara, now bet things in comedian, Chamba, Niji, Chanju, Sim, Tendetol Comne, Getaro. Kurajanya come to the cable mambo to stay there. That's some Yona Manasseh, so the Chatayora. This on the Hatcher and Bunam Sukiam Sigdo. Or teacher, this on the Chegum Peke Sambure. Chegum the Chen and assembly Joatera. Imbare, Imbasho de Shanet, Gayamare. Kuyichi de Abuderate. Cheba Chen, the Susa Samtana, or Tati one redua, Tiremado some round to be Tachiona. Buddha Chigre, Hadere, Buddha Chi in a Dumari candidate. Buddha Beran, a Tade and a peg one Busevna Shire, did draw him a door. Takarchura Umbula Tene, Tasha Agore, Luda Semni Latene, Lu Tata, you are a teacher, whatever the Taka Charge, but Ta do Ta Deg Ta Nag Ta Condusage, Tisha, you're 10 about some shower as you are. Buddha Tesula 10 about some shower. We can't get a touchable mare. Tandanganzo Tali Shagura. A tenacita sobo. One book can get something loose and children to go to a mara, lava, comba children to go to a mara. That is Miwansana. Chilo Pagwata now looked at tended so and a cochi to be our mother. So what the Miwan star your mother. Miwan did a share children to go to a royal mare. Pagwat in the mare, sat in the mare, in a loom joint in the mare. Chikango Kanga Chibare. Rangun and Mava, Rangaduma. Yeah, that is like Mount Aswan. Oh, yeah.
So, here again, if it were the case that this self and the appropriated aggregates were totally different, totally distinct, then they would become unconnected. So that's the kind of fault that incurs from there being a sort of, and again, as the essentialists would assert, that there's existence from their own side. So if there's a self that exists from its own side and it's totally different from the appropriated aggregates which exist from their own side, then it would be like unconnected, unrelated. And if it is the case then that the self is the aggregates, as it says here, and the self is neither different from the, I'm going to say appropriated, nor is it identical to the appropriated. So if it were the case that the self were identical with the aggregates, then there would be like a new self in every life. As we follow the sort of perishing of those previous aggregates, there could be no continuum. There could be no no continuity of various lives, because then with each new set of aggregates, you'd have a new self. So it's not the case that these can be totally unrelated, because again, when we talk about the self doing various things, this is only independence upon the aggregates. We can't speak of a self that is separate and apart from the aggregates. When we talk about like being I'm angry or I'm hungry or whatever it might be, it is only independence upon those aggregates that we can speak about a self. And so this is something where when we are reflecting upon this, we're engaging in what's called analytical meditation, which is so very important. Here we're talking about emptiness. And when we see in the texts, when they talk about things like impermanence or love and compassion and patience and all of these various topics, they're primarily analytical meditation kind of topics where we engage in a kind of investigation, aside from calm abiding, aside from trying to establish serenity through that kind of placement meditation. Most of the meditation that we do is analytical, is really thinking about things, is engaging in that kind of investigation and analysis, because that's the kind of meditation that really moves our mind. As we talk about in the sort of 8 states that lack freedom, there is the state of a long-lived God, referring to those kinds of beings who've developed just extremely subtle kind of meditative stabilization, such that they are born in like the 4th concentration or in the states of the formless realms, from sort of endless space, endless consciousness, nothingness, neither discrimination nor non-discrimination. These beings can be in this kind of meditative stabilization for eons without having any other kind of thought. And so although they have refined their meditative concentration to an extreme degree, this is a state that is seen as lacking freedom, because you just remain in that kind of concentration for eons. There's no other activity that happens. So it is really crucial for us to engage in analytical meditation. It is the way that we gain certainty about these various points, by thinking about, oh, is it really like this? Is this how the self exists? Is this how it is? And when we investigate for ourselves, then we can gain the kind of certainty that, again, really moves our mind. So here, when we talk about the self being dependent upon the aggregate, that it is something that is designated merely on the body and mind, this is, we're talking about the kind of selflessness of the person, but this is really the same for all various objects. When we look at like our hand or our foot or something like our eye faculty, where is that eye faculty exactly? Can we point to the thing that is that eye sense power? Well, when we look and we go through like the various skin and the various layers and so forth, we can't find anything to point to, but yet we can see. And so here, to understand the way in which, although phenomena don't exist from their own side, they exist in a manner that is merely designated. This is something that we come to an understanding of based upon our own investigation and analysis.
Hola.
Okay.
다들 돼서 걔들 공부 다 해나 깨단 직받치도 좋으시. 이게 전부 다 랑원에 주베 다들 랑원에 주베 연하서라. 다 랑원에 주베 다 돼서라. 걔들 공부대 랑원에 주베 다 연하서라. 아니 소복에 소기 풍부라 소복 풍부 제대로 긴지 제반나시 다게 되나시 긴지 제고래서라. 겨울난데 사도 거기에 제 윤심을 줘요 말어. 되나시 긴지 제고래서 걔들 풍부 다에나 풍부 제대로 긴지 제반나시 다 긴지 제고래서 되나 소보 사발레서나 다 사바사자 겨ঙ아마게 교맹게 달래기도 와 뒤에서 이제 걔들 풍부 남래시 풍부생 풍부랬던 셴바 랑원에 주베 다데 풍부래 빼 뭐 세번에시 가가요나 랑와도 주베 소소 아니나 랑와도 주베 소소래 찍찍이 깬저요 말에 근데 풍부가 띵지다 자와제바 상마 다가 자와제바 많이 봐줘 그래서라 근데 랑원에 주베 다데요나 풍부다 찍도요 말에 풍부다 다데도요 말에서 지오라 걔네 랑원에 주베 다데 민도와서래 랑원에 주베 다요 말은 다 매르스나 다 요레스 다 가르스네 공봉알라 때네 파다 와서 류다 심미도와 류다 심미기 유대 미다 던르다 다이다 스파다셔라 다 건조 자와자바데 다 자와자 때네 다 와서 샤오라 어디 샤마도 되네 그 공부를 때에 베타에 다다 원세 가가 용구여라 때네 딱 와서 다 샤토고요 말아 우마바티 송고도와 때네 딱 와서 샤주데 마셔서 애니 풍불에 때에 베타다 딱지라와지 다 세르 되서 용구여라 때네 딱 와서 다 샤마도 가르시 시리여라 소보레네 다 말에 텔레셴데 다요 말에 다 때네 딱 와서 다 풍불에 때네 봐 랍샤마도 맹게스로 차로 마 오늘아 저저 때저 소안에 양고 사바시 투어래 소보데 소르와 심데 셰바르와 샨다 셰바르와 또 셰바 마이게 소아 마이게 ngobu 사바시 투어래 팀버 틀레 다시거든 데민 두지시거라 근데 마부 여러 거 강가 찍버리다 너 참마 찍버라 강버르지네르 거다 개고 찍버 담마치 대즈대즈르네 말에 딜레 샨도 요 말와 대졸 때네 따네 디기도 강버르 강버나 때기 소소요 강가 디기도 왔다가 전 샤워르세 어디지 럼네 뒤에서 시송 바다로시아
So this is reiterated in the following quotation, where again, if the self were the aggregates, in the sense that the self and the aggregates exist objectively from their own side, then it would have to arise and cease, as in when we couldn't have any sort of continuity. The self would be perished, would have perished with the perishing of those aggregates, and we would take up a new self with the new aggregates that we take. So there would not be the possibility of there being any kind of continuum of the self. So that's not a viable option. But if it were different from the aggregates, again, in an objectively existent kind of a way, then it would not share the characteristics of the aggregates. So all of the sort of activities of the aggregates, everything that we do with our physical body or our mind, would not be done by the self, because they are totally different and separate. The self is something apart, aside from the aggregates, and so thereby we couldn't talk about the self doing anything that the aggregates had done. And so here, when we think about it in this way, we reflect on it, we can establish that there is no such objectively existent self. But does that mean then that there is no self whatsoever? Well, there is a self, but the self exists as something that is a mere designation, that is existent by way of merely dependently designating that. And there are those who aren't able to understand that. And so therefore there's a kind of fear at positing a merely designated self. And they think that there must be something that we could point to, that we could identify as being the I or the self. But so when it comes to a kind of a self in the way that it appears to us as something that is objectively existent, we can't actually find something within the aggregates. So, our physical body, that is form, that is material. The self is not something that is material. It doesn't exist as the form. And again, the self is something that is designated upon a combination of our body and our mind. So it's not like just identified with the form, but nor is our self just consciousness. And so therefore it is asserted to be something that is a non-associated compositional factor, as in it is something that is designated upon form and mind, but is neither of those. And this is something that is applicable not just to the person, but to any sort of phenomena, something like a house. We can talk about a house in dependence upon walls and windows and doors and the framing and so forth, but there's nothing that we can point to and say that is the house. Yet we can speak about a house in a perfectly functional kind of a way. And so too with the self, there isn't no self whatsoever, but the self exists as a mere dependent designation.
Oh yeah. Oh, that is the some show. lobe pagba la so do digo rawa me ba de tena ta ne yo ma yese ngoba de sama rawa du tu ba yo ma re rawa du tu be tang ni yo ma che sama cha ra ngoba rawa ye me rawa du tu ba rang ne tu ba sha la te jin del ne sha ko ge mai ba ko korang ne chi lu zu chu sai ba tak te che ne ni ye yo ba ra yu me ne nga ran de da se su te ye ba shi ko ga ti yo ma re ngoba rawa ye me se nya me ro ba sa ra o te tā rāngā tu chūpa yuwa māyī sūgu tuwa, dīgui rāngā mē bātā tēnā tāni yuwa mā sō tīrī tā, chū tam jē tāngī tu mā chū sē, tā tu mā chū sē tīrī kōgō rē, dī sāngmā tam jē rāngā tu chūpa yuwa mā, rāngā nē chūpa yuwa mā, rāngā nē chūpa tāngī yuwa mā, rāngā nē chūpa rāngā ngō yuwa mā rē sūgu rā, dīgui rāngā mē bātā tēnā tāni yuwa mā sī. O tēnī, dī rāngā tu chūpa yuwa mā rē sū, tēnchīn rē parī chūwa rē, tēnē tāk bā sāng shā gu rē. Koran rawan che den yong gyo ma re tene ta ba cha ro nga ju di na lu do sa je do na de ti pali na le wara ti chen ti me ka ni ga yu do ta kong ba de ta do de ji ma ra da ji cha wa ti ji sem se ke ne ta ni ba de nga sam nam ji nga ju lo len ji chi do nga sam ju nga ra ye sam sa soboda sem da to shi ta do me gere sam ko do o de ta shi wa tu ji sem ke ne ta war ju wa te shi ma ju tin de ta wa du chi phong bu de to de se du chi phong bu nge te na la tin de rang we ta shi wa ma da so da du chi phong bu de to de la sim je ye ma shi sim je rang wa shi wa ma ane ta me re so ma re yo re da se ga se ta se de jo yang de jo de dila simje chidar yana cho namla tene shinda cheba da tishin pumbu nam tene kunzu simje she che do sikdo o shinda da namdu da ta tensa da namdu to ya do namdu da mota da ane kar do computer da tezo ro ipad da tezo do jeju namdu re dina chala re da pak da re tene ra ya mara din namdu re do so se ya mara tezo la tene pa namru se tezo kanga soso lega chigore tezo kanga tongna namru perge namru babge se chora namru tange me yora tina miche yora ane kaja yora te ya kondu lega chigande namru perge se namru bab se do te sha ko do o tina she tene ta ko sam sha ora tejre chile zu zu sa rang ne che yo mare ngo kanga ta ra o te chi kyun jere ya.
So here, as the master Aryadeva has said, I believe it's in his commentary. Anyway, so the master Aryadeva has a quotation where he says that all of this is lacking in autonomous existence, independent existence, and therefore it is selfless. So here, because all phenomena are not, don't have this kind of independent, objective, autonomous existence from their own side, there is no established self. There is no kind of a self on those bases. So here he is clearly identifying that the meaning of selflessness is to lack that kind of objective, autonomous existence from its own side. And so here, as opposed to negating existence entirely, this establishes that phenomena are merely dependently designated. So as, and it will come here very soon in the text, citing a sutra from actually the Pali tradition. So this is common to both Theravada and Mahayana. This idea of self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. We have this kind of thought of I that holds these aggregates as if they had some kind of objective existence, but this is a wrong view. As it says, these composite aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. So when we look within the kind of basis of designation of the I, for example, you can't find something to point to and say, this is the self. But yet there is functionality. So just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon a collection of parts, we use the convention living beings in dependence upon the aggregate. And so this kind of understanding doesn't negate existence outright, but rather shows us how things actually do exist. So it is in the way of being dependent designations. We can look at these days, we have lots of objects we can take as objects of analysis. Planes are good to look at, or we could look at computers or iPads or cars or whatever it might be. Like a plane, when we look at a plane, if we try to identify, well, what is that plane? Looking from the outside, all of the various kinds of machinery that make that up, we can't find anything that we can point to and say, well, that thing, that is the plane. But yet someone flies the plane. We can ride on a plane. A plane goes up, it comes down, it can carry people, get them to their destination, and so forth. So even despite the fact that we can't point to something and say, this is that thing, the thing exists in a manner of a mere designation, and yet, and within that is able to function entirely. So there's nothing to point to in terms of our own sort of personal self or that of other objects, but yet we can speak of all of these things functioning.
Oh yeah. Oh, that is what. Oh, that 제금 제제 근데 samlo taje ne ta rawe ta namjunga ju samlo ko de tina shimido a sam jogora. Simpasha na timido sam yang gone samlo ta yone tinde yogore tina shin namju sambana shi yona kawa phumbu chigre ta tinde samlo ta ya ta rawa tu tube ta timido a sam tinde komera tele 제금 sigra. 어디 동반이 돼도 강가 제금 뺏게 전부라. 제금 매네 셈을 줘대 말해. 지지레다서 임버레 섬대셔마도 개요 말아. 어디 인데 공원에 그 삼을 날 삼을 걸고 있는 소소소 삼을 걸고 있는 소소 잡아채고라. 잠바다니 지장이 좀 강가 숑치문에 셰베 공자 정말 제금 좋으신 셰고에 가르셔라. 어디 내고도 임버체 어디 줄라 단데서네.
So here, this is really important that we do analytical kind of meditation, looking at the self as we usually think it exists and coming to determine that actually it doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us. This is something where we think about it, we reflect, use reasonings, and then based upon that analytical meditation, we can place our minds on that kind of understanding. And then we engage in that again and again. And this is the way in which we should approach most all of the topics within the great texts. We really need to look at things like, selflessness and love and compassion and so forth. These are all analytical meditations. We need to engage with the way that we normally think and actually use our kind of analytical thinking to apply that and to change that. These are the kinds of meditations that really create a change in our mind.
Oh yeah. That is why. Oh, the imbecile. That Rawa to Tube Tames, Rawa to Tube Sume, Rawa to Tube Tame, Time, Rome, Reja Pangacha, Jurida, Tachibu de Mare, Shanda, or some Yomare. Tag and Dushin, Shandal charge some door, Tambuta told Samatan de Yora. Chidarki Tag and Dushin, Shiba de Shikuna Lurchar charge. Tag told somebody I walk on a titango Kanga Chibode. Ganga around to a meva, then attack what some Shana Mato. Suktu to a Suktuba, Taxuba, Chesuba, Mevate. Ganga Chibora. Oh, this you love. Oh, this to the.
So here we should again this self as it appears to us. This is not something that exists in the way that it appears. And so it is said that as we perceive or as we understand the self, so as lacking any kind of autonomous, independent, objective existence, so we should understand all other phenomena. So it is through this kind of investigation and analysis that we begin with in terms of our own self, but then we apply that, we move that kind of understanding to all other phenomena.
Oh, yeah. That Chitabi Tayu Chusuda, that one is secret. Tana Tayo Marves, Tayo or Tase. That you ranch and you marry Pumbula Tension by Rawani to be Damere. 다 때네 따보 삼비 다 유시 디셰요라 다 유시 니와렘베 풍부 다 많이 저라 풍부래 ngom 제 현도야 다 매나 대단하 다 매반이도 다 매그래도 와서 지겨라 풍부나는 가 요리 되는 가에 따르면도 텔레베 제 현다지 다 민도 다 민도 와서나 시고라 도바꾸요라 다 매반이도 시나 아니 니와렘베 풍부 니와렘베 풍부 yola nyawa lemba bu ta me ba mra me ba ma ru se nyawa lemba phung phung nga do ne long che che do long chung ge che ko ra nyawa lemba phung bu do phung bu lang ge phung bu le te ne long chen ge che ko ra o te yo gu re che ra nyawa lemba phung bu nyawa lemba phung bu yola nyawa lemba bu ta me ba mi ro che ra nyawa lemba phung bu le te ne da do ta ba yin be Nyawalembe pumbula tene daas tagi yore. Pumbula tene tado taba imbe ta meba ina pumbula tene taba ta mena ni pumbula tene taba sedi umara. Nyawalembe kudo miru echete ese. Tena meba mosamji pumbula tene taba miru ese. Meba mosamji puste yo mara te pumbula tene taba ensin digmarwa. 다 매나 다 풍부라 때네 딱 보이 다 롱체바 보이 세 풍부라 때네 왕봉아 제 텔레 때네 수다트르자 롱체바 보이 세데 용마라 아니 데부 뇽시 나미 데부 뇽 케베 데부 뇽시 뇽게 용마라 다 요레스 예나야 때네 딱 보삼 땡지 데버리 좋아 참게 다 요레스도 어디버티 치주나
So then we turn to this section, the self that does exist. So the question arises, the appropriated aggregates are not the self, and the self is not some other entity or substance distinct from the aggregates. So does this mean that does this mean then the self does not exist? So, having refuted some kind of objectively existent self, something that is aside, apart from the aggregates, someone might have the question, well, then is this self totally non-existent? Well, in response to that, it makes no sense to say the appropriated aggregates exist, but the self that is the appropriator does not. So, here, if it is the case that we are asserting that the self is something that is designated upon the aggregates, if the aggregates exist, but the self that is the appropriator does not, that doesn't make any kind of sense. And so too, if it is the then if there is no designated self, then we would have no functioning either. So as the self is imputed in dependence upon the appropriated aggregates, if the self were completely non-existent, it would make no sense to impute a self in dependence upon the aggregates. Like you can't impute the non-existent son of a barren woman in dependence on the aggregates. So here, when we talk about there being a self that is dependent, that is imputed or designated in dependence on the aggregates, it wouldn't make sense for that to be something that is completely non-existent or non-functioning. If there is something like, if the self were not completely non-existent, then it wouldn't make any kind of sense to designate that on independence upon the aggregates. If it's just an utter non-existent phenomena.
Oh yeah. 다 담아대 셰차레 디 쿵디 장디와라. 다와 잡아게. 젠더게 들어. 그러면 다와 잡아 디 쿵장게 직세로 엄마 직세로. 사실대바 직세로 롱장게왔다. 대다른 로변 다와 잡아 엄마 직세래. 대다 임바스 디 로변 다와 잡아 직세나 송샤스오래. 근데에서는 지대 녀 랑바당 지대 녀 랑바당 녀 렘바부 지도 타완 교회 칠당하세. 와 종아다 지바니도 타완 교회 칠. 다 녀 렘베 풍부랑 신자야 마이나 하세. 딸 셰처럼 봐. 다디 공부 다 라시 찍 말해 세워라. 그래서나 뒤에나 뭐다 지대냐 렘바부 찍도 타wan 주어지래. 냐 랑자다 냐 렘바부 찍 차도로. 냐 렘바부 다르바 냐 랑자 풍붕하러. 미 껴와랑세 단도 껴와랑세 때다때 풍붕 때 랑고야라. 때 찍으려도래 텐데 말해서라. 찍도 타wan 주어지다. 조아다 직관이도 타wan 주어지래. 조아다 직관이도 타wan 주어지래. 냐왈렘베 랑신체 마힐라스 nar meba pombi kyungane meba kyongama meba saba jungda sobodu saba jungda ne joana jiban te jiksona ne kyawachima te kyunde kyawachima ke dwa mara sobude le degra rudora te kyundwa yo mara mene jiban don joare chire ta nyawalembe ranshin chaya mayinse ta de pombi ranshin chik mare se tindesa te nyawalembe pumbula tebara tadeba sondu yebesere nyawalembe ranshiche mayila te nyawalemba la madebara tadeba sondu yoba tawan yueches o te tadedo yona ya nyalengi pumbu sonala madeba kokaga dire sungunzi che yokure timbe dos tantale dosa ne yuechere Jagache Chudore. Yueche Shama is a Pumbula Shendo Yomare. And then Yalemba Matuba Sundu Shendo Yana Yalemba Sonala Matuba, Pungunziche Yokore, Pumbungabu Karuma Suni Kora Tegar Kadula. Rohanum Ziche Yoti Yomare Sora. Yoba Tawan Juecher. Yalemba Meba Yamaino Ose. Kedana ona ta medo shechawa ta mesana yagato asere. Kedana ta medo shechawa rago sente yagato asigora. O te mares ta de tando uma chise longkora da. Cheba meba nido ati manges te tawa sire bulora. Ne ta meba roso ta meba nido ngeba mares ta yore songora. Meba nido ati mange Kashi Pumbula Tene, Takwa Meadows, Pumbula Tene, Takwa Samgita Meadows, Lamne Digmarese, Meadow Shecha Chidari Yuse. Yoba Maimbe Moshamji Pubi, Yoba Maina and Moshampuna Shire, Moshampu de Pumbula Tene Tase Medoa, Tinashita, the Pumbula Tene Tata when she never do this or Miteba do this or Yoba Maimbe Moshaji Pu, Nipumbudala Tene, Dogwa Maino, Nyawalemba. Teshido nyawalemba bo medo shina nyawalemba yeshindo nyawalemba bo medo shechawa chida rigbar jude teshere tene meba nido amerito so ta meba digmares te pumbule tene takwatsando yore sora itsa shiglo ta do meba nido te manges teshere ta medo nyambe ngeba dia miteto se o tiba de chiguna.
So then, based upon the kind of reasoning that was explained above, the sort of signs that were laid out, there's then a source for this from the Clear Words commentary on the Fundamental Verses of the Middle Way by the Master Chandrakirti, in which he states then, the self is not the same nature as the appropriated, because this would entail that the appropriated and the appropriator would be the same, and also that the self would arise and perish like the aggregate. So again, it can't be the case that the self is one and the same as the aggregates that it appropriates, because then it would arise and perish with those aggregates. With each time that we, for example, take up a new form, you would then have a new self. And so thereby, the self and the aggregates, the appropriator and the appropriated, cannot be one and the same. But it's also not the case that the self, as it continues from this Clear Words commentary, the self is not separate from the appropriated aggregates, because this would mean that the self could be identified separately without depending upon the appropriated aggregates. And so also the self is not apprehended without apprehending the appropriated, because this would entail identifying a self that does not depend on the appropriated aggregates. So if it were the case, again, if the self could be apprehended in the absence of those appropriated aggregates, we can just sort of directly point to it and identify, yes, this is the self, then it would have a kind of existence that is independent of those aggregates, of the appropriated aggregates. But it's not something that we can apprehend without apprehending that appropriated base. We can't have a sense of an I without the appropriated aggregates. And so thereby, the self that is not that is somehow separate, again, and apart, distinct from the aggregates, is not something that can logically be asserted. And then, so you might think, well, if that is so, then don't you have to say that the self does not exist? Okay, so the self is not the same as the appropriated aggregates, nor is it something that is totally different and separate from those. So this person thinks, well, then don't you have to say that the self does not exist? Well, in one way, yes, the self as it appears to us normally doesn't exist. However, it is also not the case that the self does not exist, as in being something that is entirely non-existent. For how can you say that that which is imputed in dependence on the aggregates does not exist? How can you say that, like the son of a barren woman, something completely non-existent is not imputed in dependence upon the aggregates? So here, how would it be possible to say that the appropriator does not exist while the appropriated does exist? Thus, the non-existence of the self is also not tenable, and it is also not correct to say that the self does not exist. So it is suitable for us to assert that there is some kind of a self. It isn't something that exists in the way of being exactly the same with the appropriated or separate from the appropriated aggregates, but yet it is tenable to assert the existence of a self, and to say that it is utterly non-existent is not suitable.
Oh yeah. 다 the number 샤바네스 로베 산제자 그래서 다우다 버송비오다 그네 그래서 다데 때네 풍불라 때네 딱버 삼지 텐션 데버주 다그 남샤데 개버 우만 주발에 셰 딜 때네 심바치 송거라 다데 number 샤바네 개버 우만 주발에 네버 샤오세 야 데리 한스 우마 칠세 값사 값값라 셰 유스다 양자 셰 메소라 Dere kapsu number shaba che simbecher. Dere te number shaba mechao she so tibati.
So here then, closing up this quotation from the Clear Words, he says, the description of this self can be ascertained in detail in my Entering the Middle Way, because I have already described it at several points here in this work. I will not present it again here. So this is something that is explained both in Chandrakirti's Entry to the Middle Way, as well as other points throughout Clear Words. So he then isn't going to describe it in detail again at this point.
Pumbuta mare, Pumbulango, Tadabedayo mares. Tana Garson, Tene Taba Samla Tan Jogba, Imbesa, Pumbula, Tene, Pumbungala, Tene Pa, Tagwa Samji, Tanya Tagwa Samji Tasha Gores, Tene Tagwa Samji Ta, Tension Depression Tasha Gores, Nibe Pumbuda, Ochiba, Pumbuda, Ochiba, Pumbuda mare, the Pumbuda Ochiba Segura. Pumbule losu yo mare, ta taga shago za pumbuda ngo chikpa re, dokpa chikpa mare, yo, ngo chikpa se. Ta jokpa yinpe pumbuda ngo chikpa ta, gyura chen takpe da yo mare, ta gyura chen ki da yo re. Chame chikpu da yo mare, ta chada chepe da yo re. Yo, chada chepa ta, pumbula tepe, Pumbula te me go be rango to be tayo marde. Pumbu shala te ba changi tayo re sora. Pumbula te be shawa changi tane yoba nitos, or tibata chituna.
So then, having concluded the quotation from the Clear Words commentary, it says then, therefore, the self is not completely the same as the aggregate, nor is the self a totally different entity or substance from the aggregate. So here, it isn't the case that the self is exactly the same as the aggregates, nor is it a totally separate and a different entity or substance from the aggregates. However, we can posit a self that is a mere imputation in dependence upon the aggregates. So in terms of the self that does exist, we can assert a self that is a mere imputation in dependence on the aggregates. And it is then feasible that there is a self that changes and is one nature with the aggregates. Now, here, when we say that the self is something which is merely designated in dependence upon the aggregates. Using various conventions, using terms, we can designate a self upon the aggregates. And here, where it says that it is something that changes and is of one nature with the aggregates, for something to be of the same nature is not as the same as being it is just the same. So the aggregates and the self are not one and the same, but they have the same nature. So they're of one nature, but they're not of the same isolate or conceptual isolate, as in we can have them arise to our mind separately. So here, where it says that there is a self that is one nature with the aggregates, we should understand that that is not the same as being one and the same, and that it is something that has parts and is other powered in being dependent on the aggregates. So this self that we can identify as existing is something that is of the same nature as the aggregates, has various parts, is made up of parts, and is other powered in the sense that it is dependent upon the aggregates.
Oh, yeah. That's the catching Budwa. There's a Kasha, Nambe Thabkhe Mare, Thabkhe Melena, Nikawachima years, Karisigra said to do. Thabkhe Melima Marwa, Tagbata, Doji Ranch and the Pumbutation, but Thabkhe Melim, Thabkhe Lengiora. This savage a chawra, what in this and the Mambuora. Oh, teacher, Penny? Oh, yeah, teacher. Gondo Chixele Sumbatar. Chixel cousin daughter by Sonsoa, Juguele Sheba Chise, Sonsata, Jugueka, then a tag was some lata, you don't the condition in the Tishera. When I go to Chixel Sumbatar, Jubara, Tag and Namsha, Chiderson Yichinas, Jugueka, Tag and Namsha condition Yoresina, and they did son Yores Chitangiora. The other woman Juguet de Balese, Juba Randre de Roa, Juba Randre Lese. Tag Namsha, Sunjuni Tingi Lese, to wear Randinal Tiro. Dole Jan, Doi Longi Tire, Doi Lonta, Tantal, Lasara, Dole Jan, Tajicha, Tujism, Kene Tower and Joai, Duji Pumbun Detonde, Della Simpson Yomai, Chidrayala, Sonamla, Tennis in the Chuba Tars. No, Tennis in the Chubata. Tishin Pumbu Nam Tene, Kunzup Simpson Dosora. Tishin Pumbu Nam Tene, Kunzum Tanyedo, and don't number to a man, Kunzup to Simpson Shecha, your race, she son sauce and Doi Lotara. Sheben Dodi is a Dodi. Pumbula Rama Saigi, Ta maybe as a Pumbula Rama to Tubata, Saigi Tayo Mares or Ranka to be Sayesera. Kedari ever Tawa Mirun Shese. Taja Tujism Kuni Tawan Juat, Madasum Gavara, and Duji Pumbu did on the dinner around to Trubetata, the Umabachine around to Truba Rangini to Chasura, Shandane Ranget to be Savita Mese, Savara, Sheson, Ta maybe, the Dari ever Tawa Mirun Shese. Tedana Chitari Inaya. Say Gitada, Toji Rangita, Rangini to Beta Menaya, and they are that I or Dasangora. Tedanaya Chidar Shingde Yala, Rerewada, Tsokba Kaya, Shinda Mayishins, Tatala, the Chayamba Namruta Direction. Tedale Shembe, Shindaya Yomare, Namru Yomare, Yala Rele Shembe. Tedanaya Shinde Yala Tsokba Latene, De Shinda Shi, Takwa Samla Shinda Jogwatas. Shinde Yala Tsokba, Namru Chashekanga Tsokba Lega Chingatela Tene, De Tires Takwa Samla, Shigda Shagodo. Tinashi ta de pumbula tene takwa samla shagu de sor. Pumbu namle kaya ta imba ta mahi la se. Pumbu nane kaya ta mare. Pumbu teta le ngo shembe tse yo mare ta yo mare. Yoba mahi la mahiya. Pumbu namla tene takwa samje ta jo go bara sung de se. Pumbu la tene takwa samje jo. Tene ta se de tenchen de bara jo ase de ni ora. Kudan ken la tenchen de ne jo a chik se ra. Dakshi am chashe chik bare. Tela tene tedan de ne ane lo yo do ta se jo e chik do wa. Tene takbe ta tene takbe tenje tene jo e tene sini she do ode tene takbe tenje she yo ra. Tsokpala tene de shinda she takwa chanle shinda choba do pungbu namle kanya ta maye la teta le ngo shendo ya ta yoba maye ya pungbu namle tene takwa chamke ta jo go bar sunde uma jugba le ese tedar tembe pu ta go she se or teba de che chuna le bisu ya.
Mm. So here then the question arises, well, how is the self presented in Chandrakirti's entering the middle way, as his clear words mentions? So here again, the whole context for this is that there are those schools that would say, well, if Buddhists assert selflessness, then why is it that they even talk about future lives? How is it that this self actually exists? If they are asserting that selflessness is just the total absence of a self, then it wouldn't make any sense to talk about past and future lives and our concern with liberation and so forth. But yet this is something that is explained in the Buddhist texts in a way that doesn't just completely negate the self, but we need to understand how it exists. So in the way that Chandrakirti presents the self in his entering the middle way is as follows. So he begins by quoting a sutra. So this is the auto commentary that he would have written to his entry to the middle way. And so again, so self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. These composite aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. Just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon collections of parts, so we use the convention living beings in dependence upon the aggregate. So here, conventionally speaking, we can talk about a self as existing, but it isn't something that exists as a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. So according to this sutra, as there is no self in the aggregates that exists substantially in the sense of being independent, it is unsuitable to believe such a self exists. Now, again, we have to understand that there are different levels of subtlety. Here, kind of a substantially existent self is something more coarse, but we can also sort of apply this to the more refined or more subtle level. And so for something to not be existent, like from its own side, have that kind of objective existence is a way to read that. If you take the example of a chariot, neither each part of the chariot nor the collection of parts is the chariot. And there is also no chariot that is some substance separate from those. So like the kind of reasonings that we've gone through above. Yet, nonetheless, in dependence upon the collection of chariot parts, we posit chariot as a mere imputation, saying this chariot. Likewise, while none of the aggregates are the self, and there is no self that is a substance or entity separate from these aggregates, The sutra states that we must posit a self by mere imputation in dependence upon the aggregates. So here we can use the example of like a chariot, or update it and use something like a plane. But when we look for the thing as it appears to us, as existing in and of its own right, in and of itself, we can't actually find that. But yet we can speak of the self, or the chariot, or a plane, as being something that is a mere imputation, a mere designation with terms and conventions in dependence upon a particular basis. So here, when we talk about the self as being something that is a dependent origination we can understand on the level of things being produced from causes and conditions, but also in terms of dependent designation, that the mind designates with terms and concepts on a particular basis, and that level of merely imputed or merely designated existence is the way in which the self exists.
뭐야? 다들 롱치장도 음악 주고래 해서라 나와다 봐. 간절 때문에 공부 다 하고 싶 송바 대체 공부 다 하든 어디 대체 롱치 와라. 다 삼삼 삼을단도 가르치고래서네. 다지 삼바데 녀알렘베 풍부가 본데다 고나라 따오셔. 다 선생아서 따야 돼. 다를 따 그래서네. 녀알렘베 풍부데다 고나라 따오셔래. 제가 가지서 녀알렘베 풍부가데 따르 와서. 상대 좀 된데 다시 냠도 따도 녀알렘베 풍부를 메네는 아 삼사 따고 손도 와서 대공장 거라. 풍부 따임 버들. 어디 돈다디 말에서 대시하게 와라. 간질 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바 대실 풍부 따도 나서 풍부 따래서 대공장 거라 건져. 지자마 다ተ서 공장 거라. 때문에 따고 냠도 따왔더니 녀알렘베 풍부데다 코나라 따오 손도 와서 그래. 녀알렘베 풍부도 따래도 와서 산제 손도 와서 그래. 어디 때문에 말을 따서 대던다셔 간질 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바 대실 풍부 따도나 근데 그 말에서 그래. 지자마도 저래. 걔네 풍부래 생각보다 그 풍부래 된 생배 따요 말에서 다 스도사 풍부 나올로 쇼된 게 이제 또바지 여대서 라화도 주바서 근데 요 말을 다 하세 풍부를 따고 풍부를 메네 아 삼게 와래서 그래 풍부를 때네 미사데라 도가도 다다도 nga sende soso sobore chime menene nga sambudo pro phege ta resha sende phege phungbola tene ene pa mine ta tagdo phungbote ta re samge samge omara o te tandare phungbola tan shambe ta yo mares phungbola mene ta do ta ge tanda phungbola mene ta ge ores ra ta samge ores mata phungbo mai ge shanda chile mene ta se ta ge omara sungora ti phungbo ta ye beto mare 풍부를 때네 다스 파삼비오레스 티톤다레스 간지 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바대질 풍부 따되나 아니 때 말에 때네 풍래 현당 거 보데 풍부를 때 셴베 따요 말에 다 삼두 풍부를 메네 따고요레스 따고요레 송거레스라 아 수다메서 가레스는 풍부 따에네 사제 좀 되게 수다메 초다메 두시다메 시텐데 도마부나 소도와 그래서 다래 도라 디메소도 어디 말해서 와라 셰다야 되니래 야 되니래 되냐면 도션도 집어라 대체 대야라 초남라 신다니 주 신다 다다 총세 다야 같이 찍 대삼거라 신대야라 속바데 다래 삼거라 신다라 속바라 풍부가 속바데 풍부가 촉바대 신대 양라 촉바대 다래스나 소라 풍부 촉바 다이 뭐되바 대세스 거라 대세스 풍부가 촉바대 대다에서는 되마 대세 대양라 촉내는 신대니 요 풍부 양라 촉바 좀 다이 뭐되바 대세 결혼 껴 가려운 거라서나 아니 신대 양라 촉좀 대 신대래 로라서라 대세 대양라 초남라 신대니요 신대 양라 강거 루루스 비게 잘라 가져나 대주니 수숨지가 대루루스 하잖아 양라 초대어라 대신대래 루루아서라 초바점을 쓰게 말해서 초바점 다이나 풍부 초바점 다이나 신대 야라 초과 좀 신대 연구라 근데 신대가 잘라 가져네 대강가 대초샤네 대신대를 그래 대신대를 말아 저 지금 말아 신대 저 지금 말아 야라 초여 돼 그래서 대 야라 초는 신대 연구 신대 당다서 아니 다대 봉부 초과 좀 시작이네 신대들라 소본 거부터 이 차시에 간거 초과 좀 시작하고 그래서 걔네 신대 야라 차시에 간거 버저 루루제소요샤 뽕샤요나 대신대를 그래서 신대니 주루세 가르세 신다다 다니부데 차시를 때에 따고 총발해서라 신다 당다 총세 신다다 다니부데 차시를 때에 따고 총발해서 어디보다 지주나 근데
So then again, speaking about the way in which the self actually does exist. Now it says Chandrakirti is entering the middle way states, now you may claim that the teacher said the aggregates are the self, so you assert the aggregates to be the self. So here there are those who might have this kind of wrong idea that in certain places where the Buddha, the teacher, has said that the aggregates are the self, that means that the self actually is the aggregates. But really, this is asserting that the self is something which is only observable independent upon the aggregates. So this is really referring to or refuting the idea that the self could be something apart from, aside from the appropriated aggregates. So as it continues in this quotation from Entering the Middle Way, but the Buddha's statement refutes a self separate from the aggregates. In other sutras, he explained that form is not the self, and so forth. So here, where someone might want to assert that, well, but the Buddha has said that the aggregates are the self, this is not something that we can understand sort of literally, but rather that the Buddha is teaching that in order to refute the idea of a self that could be something apart from the aggregates. Now, there's another quotation here from Chandrakirti's Entry to the Middle Way, where he says that, were it not so, if we compare the chariot to the self, the mere collection of a chariot's parts would constitute a chariot. So again, for someone who wants to assert that, well, the Buddha has said that the self is just a collection of the aggregates. So really, it's that is what we can identify as the self. Well, when we look at this with the example of a chariot, if you have all of the various parts that constitute a chariot, but you just have them sort of like separate and then piled up, it's not as though we would say that that's a chariot. It can't function as a chariot. And so therefore, we can't say that just the mere collection itself is that thing. And so all of the various parts, for example, that make up a self are not in and of themselves the self, but rather they are the basis of a designation. It is that on which we are able to designate the thing as existing, but it's not as though for example, with a chariot, that just the heaped up pile of parts we would assert to be a chariot. It can't function as a chariot, but rather it is only in dependence upon the particular basis that we can have something that is dependently designated. So the self, in turn, needs to observe the aggregates, which is why the teacher has said that the aggregates are the self, or all are the basis of observation when we designate the self.
Oh yeah, that's also
Yeah, so our time is up for today, so we will have to stop there.
Oh yeah.
Thank you again, Rinpoche, and thank you so much for the beautiful motivations and your very clear teachings on this precious text.
Oh yeah.
And thank you, Katrina, for your very clear and articulate translation. So again, we won't be meeting until the end of September, and we wish Geshe very safe travels and beneficial travels, and we will see you in September. So we'll finish with some-
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
We'll finish with some dedication prayers now. May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Loseng's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Diyatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.
Hola. Mucho.
Recording stop.